So we're talking about the battle for balance this morning. And what I really want to do with the remainder of our time is to just try and tie a few things in together and just to draw a few things together and try and land somewhere that I believe is going to be impactful and significant, not just for us as women, but for us as men, for us as human beings. Does that sound good? Okay, 9 o'clock service. I think we need to wake up just a little bit more. So does that sound good? Hey, that's more like it. The people are with me. That's awesome. So I knew I was coming here and I was going to talk about balance. And so I did a little bit of research. And turns out that if you type into Google, how do I find balance in my life, it comes up with 332 million search results. Can you believe that? That's a lot of 332 million hits. All of that information for something that we don't really agree actually exists. That seems quite fantastic to me. But we get it on all fronts. I was reading a magazine the other day, and this is what it said. It said this: life is very much a balancing act. And we are always just one step away from a fall. We are constantly trying to move forward with our purpose, achieve our goals, all the while trying to keep in balance all the various elements of our lives. Life is very much a balancing act. Is that true? Is that true? Is that what we were created for? To spend our lives trying to balance our lives? Is that what God put me here on this earth to do? And so I got a bit sad. And then I turned to the Bible, and I went back to the book of Genesis. Hey, if you're here, if you're a guest, welcome. It's so great to have you. And if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, the book of Genesis is the very first book of the Bible. And so we're going all the way back, right to the very start. And this is what it says in the book of Genesis in chapter 1. It says, "So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, 'Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and the animals that scurry along the ground.'" What did God say to us when he created us? He said, be fruitful, multiply, rule, reign, govern. That doesn't sound a lot like go and balance it all to me. And then in the next chapter, in Genesis chapter 2, it says, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being." He breathed the breath of life into us. The Hebrew word there is neshomo, and it means the breath of God, the breath of life. You see, as I look in the Bible and as I read, I don't know if my purpose here is to just balance everything, is to just juggle everything. The more I read the Bible, the more I discover that why I'm here on this world, what I was put here for, the original intent of God for my life was for me to live. It was for me to be alive. In John 10:10, Jesus says, "The thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy, but I came so that they may have life, and life to the full." I came so that they may have life, and life to the full. God created us for what? For life. And Jesus came to give us life. And not just any life. A rich, an abundant, a glorious, a satisfying, a full life. A life that's lived out of power, out of passion, out of energy, out of purpose. A full life. And as we come to doing life and as we come to balancing everything or trying to balance everything, I just wonder, have we forgotten what it is to truly be alive? Have we forgotten what it is to truly live? Because being alive and living is so much more than just breathing in air. Wouldn't you agree? Being alive, living, is so much more than just breathing in air. Well, okay, Sidhara, this is great because it's Sunday, and on Sunday we come and get hyped up. But do you know what tomorrow is? Tomorrow is Monday. And let me tell you what happens on Monday. On Monday, the kids need to be fed. The cat needs to be taken to the vet. I need to take my dad to the hospital. I need to do the laundry. I need to prepare for a report that's due on Sunday. And I need to follow up with all the members of my host team from church on Sunday who didn't turn. And it goes on and on and on. And so you might be here telling me that God created me to live, but actually I can't even get by right now. You might be telling me that I'm supposed to thrive, but I can barely keep up. You might be here telling me that I'm supposed to flourish, but I'll be happy if I can even walk. So how do I carry it all of the elements of my life, if balancing it all is impossible? Because frankly, it's just exhausting. And I love Jesus. I love Jesus because I love Jesus, but I also love Jesus. Because in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus is talking to a group of similarly exhausted people. Now, he's talking to them not because they're exhausted because of this reason. They're exhausted because they're trying to keep up with every count of God's law, the very law that Jesus Christ himself came to fulfill. And this is what he says to them. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burnt out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. There's that word again. Live. Learn to live freely and lightly. The unforced rhythms of grace. You know what we were talking about in the panel just before? Well, this is where that comes from, the rhythms of life. And when we learn the unforced rhythms of grace for our lives, it helps us to live, to do life the way that God intended us to do life. Because the Word of God says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And Jesus says that he won't lay anything ill-fitting or heavy on us. Finding the rhythms of grace for our life, the flow, the pace of our lives, helps us to do life right in the season of life that we're in. So then, why don't we? Why don't we do that? Where did we lose sight of the fact that life was about living, but actually we decided that life was about balancing and surviving and existing? Where did we lose sight of that? And how do we get those rhythms of grace back into our lives? Well, I'd like to continue in this book of Genesis and move on to the next chapter. And in the next chapter, we come across Eve. Eve was the first woman, the first female. She was the first lady, like literally, of the whole world, like the literal first lady. And it was to Eve and her husband Adam that God spoke those very first instructions where he said, be fruitful, go and multiply. It was for Adam and Eve that God created this great expanse, this paradise, this Garden of Eden, which is where we find Eve in this very story. And I think there are a few lessons to be learned from her story. And so we're going to read Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, and this is what it says. It says, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, well, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. You must not touch it, or you will die. You will certainly not die, the serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and she ate it. And that was the moment when sin first entered the world, when Eve disobeyed God. What does that have to do with balance? Probably very little. But it has everything to do with life and living. There are two things I want to draw out really quickly from this story. Here's the first one. Eve was in the middle of this paradise that God had created, this garden of glory that he had created, all that he had given her. She was right in the very center of it all. But in that moment, Eve chose to listen not to the voice of God, she chose to listen to the voice of the serpent. And at that very minute, her whole perspective changed. What she once found to be beautiful, what she once found to be a blessing, what she once found to be bountiful, suddenly didn't seem enough anymore. One voice. What she heard changed what she saw. And what she saw then changed what she did. You see, what we hear impacts what we see. And what we see will impact what we do. Our perspective will determine how we experience our life. Our perspective determines how we experience our life. Eve should never have listened to that voice. But what about us? What kind of voices do we listen to? God's voice? Do we listen to the enemy's voice? What about our voices? What do we keep telling ourselves? What does our internal dialogue sound like? If what we hear determines what we see and what we see determines what we do, then maybe, just maybe today, the first step to getting back to living is to change what we're hearing. How do you change what you're hearing? It's pretty simple. Change what we're saying. Language is powerful. Proverbs 8 says, the tongue has the power of life and death. The tongue has the power of life and death. And what are we saying to ourselves? What are we using our tongues for this morning? Are we speaking life to ourselves or are we speaking death? We can look at the situations of our life, and yes, they're challenging, and yes, there's a lot on, and yes, there's a lot to juggle or a lot to try and balance that we've already said was impossible. And we can look at those circumstances and we can choose an internal dialogue that's disempowered, that says, everything just happens to me. I have no control over it. I have no authority. I have no power. Or we can look at those same situations, those same challenges, and we can choose to talk about it differently so that we will see it differently, because our perspective determines how we experience our life. So maybe now we say, hey, I get to fold the laundry, not because I have to, but because God has blessed me with a family that I love. Hey, I get to go to the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm preaching to myself here. Not because I have to, but because God has given me a body that's fit and able. Hey, and now I get to walk the dog because my kids love this animal. I get to go to work and put in 16-hour days because God has blessed me with a job. No longer must I have to, I need to. No, now I get to, I choose to, I want to. We choose. And in that choice, suddenly, very suddenly, as my internal dialogue changes, I start to feel not overwhelmed or stressed or anxious. I start to feel thankful. I get grateful, and gratitude is an attitude that leads to life. And suddenly, I see the blessing and not just the boundary. I see the life and not just the lack. Suddenly, I see the purpose and not just the pain. Maybe, just maybe this morning, we need a change of perspective. Here's the second one. We're going to talk about purpose. I love this quote by Robert Byrne. He said, the purpose of life is a life of purpose. The purpose of life is a life of purpose. Now, Eve knew what her purpose was right at the very beginning, right at the very start, because God told her, He said, be fruitful, multiply, rule, reign, govern. The keys of the kingdom were given to her. And what did Eve do with them? She traded away her purpose on the back of a possibility. And when you give away purpose, you also give away identity. Because who we are is intrinsically linked to what we were created for. Do you know what the purpose of your life is? Or more importantly, do you know what the purpose of your life is in this season of your life? The key to finding the unforced rhythms of grace in our lives is to discover the purpose for the season in our life. I'm going to say that again. The key to finding the unforced rhythms of grace in our lives is to discover the purpose for each season of our lives. And notice the words that Jesus used, the unforced rhythms of what? Of grace. Do you know that you can be graced for certain things in certain seasons? And so what you're graced for in the last season may not be what you're graced for in this season. So the question today is, what are you graced for in this rhythm of life, in this season that you're in? Because our purpose determines our priorities. No, actually, our purpose streamlines our priorities. And then suddenly, we don't have to do everything, but we've chosen some non-negotiables. And that doesn't mean that we do nothing else, but it means that when push comes to shove, when I need to make a choice, I choose the non-negotiables because they are the priority in my life. And those priorities have been shaped by my purpose in this season. Purpose gives us an idea, a bigger picture of what our lives are really like. Purpose shows us what this life, we see our lives as it really is. And we see God for who He really is. Our lives are beautiful tapestries woven together by this creator God, by this infinite God. And He calls us to a life that's larger, that's more extraordinary, that's greater than we could imagine, and greater than the one that we've settled for. He calls us to be a people who are more than the things that we've become. Right in the very season that we're in, this season of being a wife, of being a mother, of being a doctor, of being a lawyer, or if you're a man here, of being a husband, of being a grandfather, right in the very purpose of this season of our lives, what do we find? We find life, and we find life to the full. Hey, this morning I've come to tell you that God is with you, and He is good, and He calls you to a place that is bigger, more expansive than you can imagine. Yes, right in the middle of the season that you're in. Yes, right as you're changing that diaper. Yes, right as you're cleaning that sick off that carpet. Right in the middle of the season that you're in, because there is extraordinary life hidden in the ordinary, mundane life. Extraordinary life hidden in the ordinariness of our lives. And God is no liar, and He is no man's debtor. What He has promised you will come to pass. He is not a liar, and He is no man's debtor. What He has promised you will come to pass. And as you stretch, and as you enlarge, and as you live, you will see His goodness. You will see His faithfulness. He is the same God that He was yesterday, today, and He is the same God who will be tomorrow. And He's the God that didn't fail you then, and He's the God that isn't going to fail you now. And you better believe that His word does not return to Him void. He is fulfilling the purpose of your life in the season of your life that you're currently in. He's fulfilling the purpose for your life right in the middle of the season of life that you're in. And yes, do you know what? Sometimes it does get hard. Sometimes it does get stressy. And sometimes it just all gets a little bit too much. And what do you do at that time? You run to the one who gave you that purpose in the first place. You run to the God of the universe who gave you that purpose for that season in the first place. And you lift your eyes up. Psalm 121, I lift my eyes up to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the God, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you neither slumbers nor sleeps. Psalm 34, I sought the Lord and He answered me. He delivered me from all of my fears. Taste and see that the Lord is good. 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. These are not the days to survive. These are not the days to exist. These are not the days to live small, to balance. No, these are the days to live, to be alive, to live a life of power, of passion, of energy, of hope, of faith, a big life, embracing all that God has for us right in the middle of the season that we're in. One of my favorite quotes is by a guy named St. Irenaeus. I don't know if I've said that right. St. Irenaeus? I'm going to go with it. And he said this. He said, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. Isn't that powerful? The glory of God is a human being fully alive. And as I look at Eve on that day, standing in the garden, in the middle of all that she had, all that was given to her, She looked at the one thing that she couldn't have. And she looked at the tree, and she looked at the fruit, and she asked herself a question. Can I be more? Can I be more? Do you remember when I said that when you give away your purpose, you also give away your identity? The serpent is very cunning, very crafty, very clever, and he comes and tells Eve, hey, Eve, you can be more. If you eat that fruit, you can be like God. And do you know what the very sad thing about it all is? The very sad thing about this story is that Eve already was. She already was like God. Because remember what we read in Genesis chapter 1? So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. She already was like God, created in his very image. Can I be more? Eve, you already are. And I already am. And you already are. But when we give away purpose, we give away our identity, and we forget who we already are. And who we already are is more than enough to carry all that we have to carry in this season, in this rhythm, right now, in this middle of life. So it's not about trying to be more, it's about trying to be who you already are, living out of who you already are, living out of all that God's already put within us. Because Eve, and because Sharon, and because Tim, and because Margaret, and because Rob, and because Jeremy, because God has already breathed the very breath of life into you, neshama, the breath of God. And he comes to us and he says, now go and live. Go and live. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. Now go and live. Go and be all that I have created you to be, carrying everything I've created you to carry. Be alive.